Underdrafted Archetypes in Ikoria. Hello there and welcome back to another episode of Outside Notes. This time we're going to do Underdrafted Archetypes in Ikoria. As the format goes on, you start to get a good feel for the archetypes that you know, like red-white cycling or maybe the mutate deck. But this is the time to look around for archetypes that aren't drafted quite so much. As you sit down to draft, we don't get to choose what deck we have. We have to read the signals and draft our seat. But here's the thing. If you have experience having drafted some of the lesser drafted archetypes in a format, when it's open, you'll know what to do. Today, we're going to go over some of those archetypes. Now, these aren't necessarily the tier 1 best of the best, but if they're open and if you know how to draft them, you can win with them. The first one, and maybe my favorite, is blue-red Otters. Since Thieving Otter is a common, you can pick up multiples of them, and that is what you're going for here. Now, of course, the core of the deck is Thieving Otter, and you're going to want 2, 3, or maybe even 4 of them if you can get them. Sea Dasher Octopus also counts. Now, the idea is you want to play a Thieving Otter on turn 3, and then you want to continually be able to get it in for damage for multiple turns in a row. Now, the absolute classic for that in this format is turn 3, Thieving Otter, turn 4, Dreamtail Heron, like we talked about last week. But there are other ways to get it through. For example, Avian Oddity to give it flying off of the cycle. That will usually get it through for 1. And you can even do Wingspan Mentor to put a flying counter on your otter and get it through that way. Interestingly, otters go very well with Frostlings. Frostlings is one of the best friends of the otter. They absolutely love each other. You can play an otter, Frostlings down their bigger blocker, and attack in early and start getting those beats flowing. For me, I'll take about as many Frostlings as I can possibly get. And they even have the extra benefit of making a good plan B in case they kill your otter, you can mutate onto the lynx. Now you have other ways in blue to get those creatures out of the way, cards like Capture Sphere, Gust of Wind, even Pouncing Shore Shark, and Frostbale Ambush, which by the way, you can cast it. In a pinch, you can even use Starting Development to make your otter into a 4/4 if your opponent has blocked. And let's not forget, they are more likely to block because nobody wants to get hit by the otter. A couple of cards that seem like they might be good in this type of archetype, but you want to avoid these type of cards generally. Phase Dolphin, for example, seems like it would go great with the otter. It actually doesn't play out that way. It's too slow. Same thing with Keep Safe. If your opponent wants to kill the otter, they're almost always going to have a window to do so, and Keep Safe ends up rotting in your hand too often. If they do manage to kill your otter and you're looking down at a hand with Phase Dolphin and Keep Safe, you're not going to be happy. You want your cards that support the otters to also be good on their own. Fire Prophecy is your best common. It's super efficient and it kills most of the things that people can play on the first 3 to 4 turns of the game. Blitz of the Thunder Raptor is also pretty good, but it doesn't kick in until the later part of the game, so Fire Prophecy is actually better. Porky Parrot, as we talked about last week, is a sweet combo with the otter, and if you can pick one up, you want it for this deck, no doubt about it. Rumbling Rock Slide is slow, but kills pretty much anything, and I mentioned Pouncing Shore Shark as a good option at Uncommon to get a blocker out of the way and even upgrade your otter to a 4/3. So the big picture on this deck is you want to play an otter on turn 3, then you want to use your tempo and removal spells to keep their creatures out of the way, hit them again, and eventually you tempo them out. You build up a bigger board with more cards than they have and their life totals going down, and that's how you win the game. 16 to 17 land, depending on how many cyclers you end up with in your deck. 12 to 14 creatures, you'd like 2 to 4 otters if you can get it. I mean, you probably play more if you can find them. As many Frostlings as you can get. And then the rest are kind of normal, powerful filler cards for this color pair. The rest of your deck basically are board affecting cards like removal spells, bounce spells, or counter spells. Basically just ways to keep your opponent's creatures and blockers off the battlefield long enough for your otters to take over. Also in the creature section, you will want some number of mutate cards to help turn those otters from 2/2s into something bigger and often with an effect that helps you out. Next on the list is a classic. It is blue-white Fliers, which is such a common archetype that sometimes people overlook it. So the idea behind a blue-white Fliers deck is that you have enough Fliers so that you can put 4 or maybe 5 power in the air, and then enough ground creatures, removal, and tempo plays so that your slower opponents can't race you once you get your air force going. You can use high toughness creatures to gum up the ground, or bounce spells to set your opponent back, each time hitting them for 3, 4, or 5 damage in the air until they're dead. So in order to make a good Fliers deck, you're obviously going to need some Fliers. You've got a lot in this set. Avian Oddity, Dreamtail Heron, which makes any of your creatures into a flying, of course, except for humans. Skycat Sovereign's one of the best cards for the deck, but it isn't rare, so you won't see it often. Sometimes I first pick the Sovereign and then end up in this deck, and that's a good reason to be there. Jubilant Skybonder is an overlooked uncommon, and it makes life very difficult for your opponent because the best way to defeat the Fliers deck is simply to kill the Fliers on the other side, and Skybonder makes that difficult. Helica Glider, Patagia Tiger, and Vulpikeet are all playable commons in the deck, but nothing to write home about. Now, as is often the case with fringe archetypes, you're not only taking the most powerful possible cards for your deck, you're also looking to take advantage of less popular cards but that happen to fit your archetype. In this case, that's usually the high toughness creatures like Mane Serval or Phase Dolphin, maybe even Aegis Turtle can make it into the deck, because all you need to do is hold off your opponent's ground force for long enough for your air force to win. Some good cards that happen to be excellent here as well. Cards like Pacifism, so your opponent can't kill you on the ground. Capture Sphere is the blue expensive Pacifism. And Frostlinks is excellent in this deck as well because it slows down one of their big creatures and it either trades or blocks with something. It can buy you multiple turns on its own. In fact, apparently it's not only good here, but also especially good here. Also, Gust of Wind. Gust of Wind only costs 2 mana if you have a Flyer, and obviously that's going to be the case pretty often in a deck like this. Reconnaissance Mission is truly at home in this deck as well, because sure, you can cycle it if you need to, but if you have 3 Flyers in the air that are getting through and you can play Reconnaissance Mission, you're going to draw 3 cards and you're going to run away with the game. Another great card in this deck is Mystic Subdual. It really does act as a full-on removal spell. It locks down a big creature or a mutate pile and makes it so that your high toughness blockers can block basically anything outside of like 6 power or more. Fight as One is a combat trick that is pretty darn powerful and works well in this deck. If they go for a Blood Curdle on your key Flyer and you have a cheap 1 mana way to protect it, you're very likely to win that game. Splendor Mare is another good card that you can cycle, put a lifelink counter on one of your Flyers, and make it almost impossible for your opponent to race you on the ground. And last, Keep Safe. This actually is a decent place for Keep Safe because you usually end up with multiple Flyers, and then if you could just simply untap and have Keep Safe up, it's a blowout if they go and try to kill one of your Flyers. Now these next cards maybe aren't quite as good as you'd think, even though they look good for the archetype. Stormwild Caprador. You can't really damage it in this color pair, so it really relies on your opponent having like red burn spells as their main way to get your creatures dead, so it doesn't excel, but you can put it in the deck. This also is a very on-board style deck, and that means that card draw spells go down in value for you. Yeah, it's tempting to put blue card draw spells in decks like this, and if you put one in, it's not a disaster, but you're much better off putting cards in that affect the board or that prevent your opponent from developing theirs. For the big picture, you want, again, 16 to 17 lands depending on how many cyclers you have, 13 to 16 creatures, and they kind of get split between, is this going to slow stuff down on the ground or is this going to be a Flyer? 3 to 4, maybe more if you can get them, removal and or counter spells. This deck works very well with Neutralize as well as Essence Scatter. And then you can put 1 to 2 protection spells like we talked about, Fight as One or Keep Safe, to keep your attackers flowing in the air, and then the game ends very quickly. This is an absolutely classic archetype, and it's one that I can definitely recommend, but you need to get the top end stuff. The commons aren't quite enough to push it over the edge. You need to get some uncommons or rares in the mix to really make it go. All right, our last archetype is one that is kind of core to the set and is actually fairly common, but I still feel like is a little bit underdrafted, and it's black-white humans. Hey. This is kind of a classic go-wide strategy that has a cool sub-theme. So basically, you want creatures that make more than one creature when they enter the battlefield, and then you want to take advantage of having expendable creatures and also a lot of creatures. For example, cards that make multiple creatures from one are cards like Whisper Squad, Day Squad Marshal, Valiant Rescuer, Night Squad Commando, and General's Enforcer. These cards allow you to build out a wide board of small creatures that then you can leverage to win the game. For example, if you have a large board of creatures, a card like Coordinated Charge can win you the game on the spot. Perimeter Sergeant wants to see as many humans around it as possible. Sanctuary Lockdown is another card that rewards you for having multiple creatures, in this case humans, and even lets you use it to tap down your opponent's creatures to clear the way for the victory. Bastion of Remembrance creates one creature when it enters the battlefield, but rewards you for having lots of expendable creatures because when they die, you get a bonus. Now, one caveat, this is a primarily humans-based deck, and that means that during the draft, you need to make sure to devalue mutate creatures. This is, of course, because they can't mutate onto humans, so it's less likely that you'll actually have a target for your mutate creature, so you want to pick them a bit lower than you normally would. Now, from a big picture, you want to have, again, 16 to 17 lands. You do need your mana for a deck like this. And then you're going to play a lot of creatures. I'd say 14 to 17 creatures, mostly humans, and prioritizing the ones that make more than one body when they enter the battlefield. Of course, you're going to want to play 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 removal spells if you can get them. And this particular color pair, black and white, has access to premium removal, so you shouldn't be short on that. And then the rest are mass pump effects or ways to take advantage of having a huge board. What you want to do is build out your board with a normal creature curve, but one that allows you to have multiple creatures, build a wide board, get in early, and then use cards like Coordinated Charge to finish off your opponent in the late game. It's a very powerful strategy that can go around some of the big creature decks in the format, and there is a lot of support for humans here. Okay, so there's a few of the archetypes that I found and had some success with in the format, but it wouldn't be Outside Notes if we didn't have a guest. And frankly, it wouldn't be Outside Notes if we didn't have Ben Stark on here in some way. Sometimes he's doing some nonsense, but we're going to get him on the line now to talk Underdrafted Archetypes in Ikoria. There he is. It's the Ben Stark. What's up, buddy?
Not much. How's it going?
We're just talking Underdrafted Archetypes here with our listeners on Outside Notes. And Ben, you've been featured on this show a lot, although it's often video clips from your stream where you're doing nonsense or winning some crazy game or whatever. And I figured it was time we had you back on to talk actual strategy. So first off, thanks for taking the time.
Hey, thanks for having me. You know, I come on any chance you give me.
First off, let's talk big picture here. We're getting to the stage of the format now where the sort of premier archetypes are pretty well known, and people have had a chance to draft them numerous times. So now it's time to start looking for the archetypes that aren't drafted as much. When you go through sort of the normal course of a format, when and how do you approach those less popular archetypes?
That's a really good question. Normally, I draft a lot, so time's not really that big of a constriction. Like, I'll do so many drafts really quickly. So what I'm trying to do is figure out all of the tier 1 archetypes. Mm-hmm. Tier 1 doesn't have to mean you're going to play it with equal frequency, but it means like an average version of it is going to be competitive with an average version of any other deck.
So you're hitting the ground running then. From the first drafts that you do, you're looking for any of these viable archetypes.
Yeah, I always describe it as having weapons in your arsenal, right? Because you never know what the draft is going to send you. Like, that's, the concept I'm famous for, drafting the hard way. It's, listen, I'm not against cycling. I draft cycling. If I open Fox or Eden Flare and people are passing it to me, it's the best deck. If it's open, I'm happy to draft it. Mm-hmm. But what happens when I don't open Flare? When 2 of the 3 people to my right are drafting it, when it's not open? Then you can't really draft cycling. So every archetype you know how to draft, that is competitive when, you are seeing it when it's open, that's like a weapon in your arsenal for going into a booster draft.
How much of your sort of institutional knowledge of draft do you bring in? For example, if there's an archetype that commonly comes up in sets, like let's say a red-green beatdown deck with big creatures and some burn spells, how much of that do you apply to a new set, or are you trying to kind of come at it clean?
As far as like the archetypes, I mean, you kind of got to see what they're doing. Like there are formats where red-green is about explore or whatever, and formats where it's about big creatures, and formats where it's about little creatures. I mean, you really kind of just got to see what the colors are doing in that given format. One of the best ways to kind of cheat code this in this day and age is if there's cycles of gold on commons. It feels like R&D purposefully makes the gold uncommon, the red-black uncommon.
Yeah.
That's gold. That seems to fit what the archetype is trying to do. That's a good little cheat code, but it's not the case all the time with every gold uncommon, not by any stretch. For
Ikoria specifically, are there any decks that you've been drafting that aren't on that kind of tier, that really headliner status of red-white or mutate or something like that?
I think that there's like black-red sack, which it's nowhere near as obvious as Sacrifice was in Theros, where it was all keyworded and mechanic and clearly what the deck was trying to do.
Right.
Like in this format, there's just some natural synergy that's pretty good between like Coil Bug and Bushmeat Poacher and Mutual Destruction, plenty of removal and small creatures to put together like a grindy red-black that kind of takes advantage of that. And Tentative Connection, of course.
Right.
So you can steal their creature and then you can sack it to Mutual Destruction or to Bushmeat Poacher. And then black-red tends to have the menace creatures, even though it doesn't have a ton of them. So you can often play Tentative Connection for 1 mana and then sack it to a Poacher for 1 more mana or Mutual for 1 more mana and still do something else that turn. And
right.
So I think that's an archetype I've drafted a handful of times, and I would definitely say is tier 1. That's an archetype that should probably only support 1 or a little less than 1 player per draft, whereas
Right.
red-white cycling should support 3 players per draft. But if I'm in a seat to draft that black-red deck and it's wide open, I think it's competitive with the other tier 1 archetypes.
All right, Ben, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with us and give us a little bit of an edge on the competition. We always appreciate it.
Hey, like I said, thanks for having me anytime, Marshall.
Hey, we'll see you on your stream, okay?
Later.
See you, buddy. So as always, great stuff from Ben there. You can find him on his stream, of course. And thanks, Ben, for giving us great insight into the format. Before we go, a few highlights, shall we? All right, this first one comes from our friend MTG Nerd Girl. And she has a Winota in limited and even hits twice. Not bad. Checkpoint Officer, sure. And a Keensight Mentor, yes, that's pretty nice, right? I mean, it's hard to do that. This isn't an easy thing to do with Winota. You got to have this mix of whatever. So good stuff there. This next one's incredible. So check this out. This guy has the opponent at 1 with a 4/6 flyer. Eerie Ultimatum. Look at that graveyard.
¡No tiene nada con volar, amigo!
And somehow none of them have flying.
¡Le gano igual! ¡No tiene volar!
No flying, no reach, no life gain.
¡No me digas que le gano esto, amigo! ¡No! ¡Amigo, le gano igual!
That is just incredible stuff. How do you get like 10 creatures back and not one of them can kill a thing, bounce a thing, block a thing? Just don't do it. And this next one, I'm so excited. Somebody actually did it. This is incredible. Watch. It happened. We talked about it last week. Classification, your creature. Exactly 13 power on an opponent on 13 life. Classification, your Fertilid. Win the game. That is completely absurd. You know, I have to admit, when we put this in the episode, I didn't think anybody actually had done it. It happened. It's real. It's a strategy. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Outside Notes. I wanted to give you some ideas on what you could draft that's a little off the beaten path for your next draft. Hopefully you got this out of this episode, but keep your eye open for other archetypes. These aren't the only ones that are underdrafted in Ikoria, and have fun at your next draft. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Outside Notes. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out. If you'd like to see more content like this, make sure that you subscribe down below, and we'll see you next time.